Tucker Carlson showed up in Moscow this week to interview Vladimir Putin. It turned out to be anything but an interview. Putin droned on for 2 hours and 7 minutes, while Tucker sat there like an eager puppy. During the Cold War, gullible Westerners who spread Soviet propaganda were dismissed as useful idiots. But calling Tucker that is unfair to useful idiots. No, he's made a cynical decision to chase MAGA's affection for dictators. And what better way to cash in than Putin's Kremlin?
All right, guys, so we got to talk about what is probably going to go down as one of the most watched interviews between a journalist and a world leader in all-time history. That is the interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin. And this interview has a lot of the Western journalists in the mainstream liberal media upset. They're boohoo, whining, and crying because they are jealous of the fact that despite Tucker Carlson not having a mainstream liberal media platform or a legacy media conglomerate behind him, he is still much more relevant than any of these people could ever hope. Okay, and this is why they're upset. It's the same reason why they were upset with Joe Rogan. Okay, Joe Rogan gets a platform of hundreds of millions of viewers, even though he did not go to school, Ivy League universities, to get these nice fancy degrees that people like Chris Wallace have. And what these mainstream liberal media journalists, aka propagandists, are learning the hard way is that their fancy journalism degrees don't amount to a hill of beans in today's society, because journalism, in regards to the profession, is not looked upon as highly as it used to be, because, again, it's become clear and obvious that journalism in the West is just propaganda, which is something that Vladimir Putin pointed out in this interview. And I watched the whole interview, and I got to tell you guys my top takeaways from this interview. And my number one takeaway is the fact that Putin is operating at an intelligence level that we rarely ever see in American politics. In fact, I was listening to this interview and I found myself very, very, very disturbed by the fact that we're not sending our best to represent us in Washington, D.C., okay? I don't think that there are many politicians in the United States. I don't think we've had many presidents in the last 20 or 30 years that are operating at the same intelligence level as Putin. And it just goes to show that as a society, we really don't elect intellectuals to office, okay? And that is a very disturbing thing that I realized watching this interview. But besides that, I think Putin brought up some very important points about the threat that the US dollar is under, okay, and how we essentially abused it by sending it all across the world, using it as a tool to accumulate power. He talked about the expansion of NATO to the east. He also talked about how they were allegedly brokering peace talks in Istanbul, in which Zelensky decided that he didn't want to have peace talks anymore because he's being controlled by the West. That's according to Putin, that is. But I actually believe that the real reason why is because Ukraine doesn't want to give up Crimea officially, or the regions that are currently under occupation from Russia that are in dispute. I think that's the real reason why. He also at one point mentioned that Russia tried to join NATO. He actually asked Bill Clinton about Russia joining NATO, in which Bill Clinton went back to his handlers and talked about it, and then came back to Putin and said, I'm not sure we can do that. I think that Putin also said that he tried to work with the West on a missile defense system. And finally, and most importantly, he signaled that he is open to potential peace talks and bringing the war to an end in Ukraine, but the United States has to stop sending weapons to Ukraine first. And he said that the war will be over in, quote, a few weeks, which basically to me sounds like he wants to take over all of Ukraine. So I don't really trust Putin all that much. I think there's some details that I would have liked for Tucker to go into with Putin to clarify some of the things that he was saying. But I still thought overall it was a good interview, okay? And me personally, it kind of seems like Russia is the little brother of the United States that wants to essentially work with the United States in some ways in order to benefit themselves. But the United States has this kind of phobia of Russia that is lingering from the Cold War, where they feel like any type of cooperation with Russia is going to allow the old Soviet Union to come back. And that's part of the reason why we push them away and we don't want to let them into our sphere of influence or let them be a part of the West, so to speak, even though Putin is claiming that he's kind of attempted to do that. But yet, for as intelligent as Putin allegedly is, he doesn't seem to be intelligent enough to understand the tricks of the West, okay? And he's essentially allowed the United States and the West to outsmart him and to play him consistently. And it seems like he's kind of airing out those grievances about being played by the United States and the West in this interview. And it's funny because as much as the Western media wants to make Putin out to be some strongman dictator, to me, I don't know, man. This interview kind of came off as a little bit of weakness here because he's essentially gotten to a war of attrition with Ukraine, a nation that does not have nearly the military capabilities that Russia has. And Putin has made various threats about what he would do or the escalation that would occur if the United States continues to support Ukraine with, for example, long-range weapons and things of that nature that Putin claimed was a red line, and he didn't actually really fulfill his promises. That, along with his apparent willingness to try to work with the West, despite the fact that we keep telling him to go away, we don't really want to work with you, we're actually trying to, take you out, right? That to me seems to indicate weakness, right? That he's not like the leaders of Russia or the Soviet Union in the past. Like, he's not Stalin, right? He's not really that strong. He's not as ruthless as some Russian leaders in the past have been, which goes against this narrative that is being pushed here in the United States about, Putin being some, strongman dictator that, is a bloodthirsty killer, which, I mean, I'm not saying that he's not, but he doesn't seem as ruthless as some of the Russian leaders of the past. That's what I'm saying. He seems to be kind of in a position of weakness. So again, that's my main takeaway. All right. But we're going to talk about mainstream liberal media and their takeaway. And of course, their takeaway is going to be jealousy and hate and not actually a real analysis of the interview itself and the things that Putin was saying. So without further ado, let's get into Chris Wallace, hate on Tucker Carlson for getting an interview that he can't get. So let's get into it.
Now for another edition of Tell Me Why I'm Wrong. Tucker Carlson showed up in Moscow this week to interview Vladimir Putin. It turned out to be anything but an interview. Putin droned on for 2 hours and 7 minutes while Tucker sat there like an eager puppy. Occasionally, but rarely, he got in a question, like this one about the power of the deep state in Washington.
It sounds like you're describing a system that's not run by the people who are elected in your telling.
That's right. That's right.
But more telling than what Tucker asked is what he didn't ask. Nothing about why Putin invaded a sovereign country. Nothing about targeting civilians. Nothing about Russian war crimes.
Well, he didn't ask about Russian war crimes, but if you actually listen to the interview, Putin does explain his justification for the war. It's just that the mainstream liberal media doesn't actually want to talk about Putin's justification for the war because they don't want you to know about that, right? They don't want you to know that Putin feels like NATO betrayed their promise not to expand eastward during talks to end the Cold War back in the early 90s between the leader of the USSR at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the U.S. Secretary of State, James Baker, in which the Russians allege that there was a promise made verbally for NATO not to expand in exchange for East Germany basically being allowed to reunite with West Germany, Germany becoming whole. Now, this is right before the USSR collapsed. Now, the West, their side of the story is that, well, we never actually made these promises. They're not in writing, so therefore it doesn't really apply. Okay, they're saying that they never made the promises. Now, when the USSR collapsed in 1991, what happened was that a lot of these countries that was under the Warsaw Pact, that was under Soviet control, Soviet defense assurances, they were no longer under the control of the Soviet Union because the nation was collapsing. And then at that point, some of these former Warsaw Pact countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland were requesting membership into NATO after the USSR collapsed. And NATO is saying, look, they asked to request entry into NATO. We didn't actually really expand. They wanted to be a part of NATO. And since these promises were not written, and also these promises were made when the Soviet Union was still in existence, basically we didn't really betray you, okay? Because one, the promises are not written down, and two, these Eastern Bloc countries actually requested entry into NATO. There was no real NATO expansion. No, they wanted to be a part of NATO, and that's how they gained entrance in 1999. So now apparently Putin sees that as a threat, okay, because NATO is a military alliance that initially was formed for defense purposes. But when Russia tried to join NATO, hey, can we join you guys' club here, okay, and defend ourselves? NATO initially kind of said, yeah, but no, you can't do it. We're actually building these missiles to defend against you, right? To eventually use against you, okay? That's kind of how Russia has interpreted what is happening with NATO, the expansion of NATO. That is the way that they see it, okay? You know, that's both sides of the story. Now, I don't know why the American media is afraid to tell both sides of the story. Apparently, telling both sides of the story is dangerous, or it's disinformation from the Kremlin, right? When they can just literally just tell both sides of the story, this is how both sides feel, and then they can let the people decide, hey, you know, what is right. Now, me personally, I don't think that regardless of Putin's claims of betrayal, I don't think that justifies invading a sovereign nation, okay, which is Ukraine. Now, obviously, it goes without saying, Putin's reasoning kind of goes beyond that. Again, I just gave you guys kind of a short gist of kind of what is often cited, okay, from the Russians. But again, I think it's just a damn shame that the American media, they never tell this story, right? They never present this and say, hey, well, this is what they're saying, okay? And, you know, responses like this to Tucker Carlson's interview is exactly what I'm talking about. How the American media fails to educate people on the issues.
A reporter can ask Putin a tough question if he wants a real interview. Why is it that so many of the people that oppose Vladimir Putin end up dead or close to it?
Now, what's funny about this is that CNN is the same network that claims that, hey, well, we must ask world leaders tough questions when it comes to war. But yet they do these types of interviews with Vladimir Zelensky.
As a human being, so many people look up to you. They rely on you. No one can imagine how hard that is. Do you do anything for yourself? Are you ever able to take a minute to read or to listen to music or something to sort of give yourself that a moment?
I have such moments, important, to be in silence, to be alone. Alone, how can I be alone? Alone I can be with music, it's true, or with a book. And early in the morning, when there are no sounds in...
No air raid sirens.
No people, nobody. I mean, the people, our staff. I mean, nobody is in my cabinet, nobody. Yeah. I can just read, think, and the music helps, really.
What music do you like?
Oh, I like AC/DC and Ukrainian music. Yeah. Of course, I like Ukrainian music a lot because Ukrainian, that's native language. That's why you understand not only music, you understand the words and etc. AC/DC, I don't understand all the words because of...
But you like the music.
Yeah, so I wonder if Chris Wallace believes that that's journalism, right? What you just saw there, that very softball interview from CNN asking Zelensky about his musical interest rather than whether or not Ukraine is actually trying to pursue some type of peace agreement with Russia, okay, or whether or not Zelensky is being influenced by leaders in the West in regards to their ability to come to a peace agreement. Yeah, I think that those are questions that should be asked that we don't get answers from Zelensky because the Western media doesn't ask him these questions. Again, it's amazing how that works. Putin is supposed to get hardball interviews, and if you don't basically press him on war crimes and all of the other allegations of Russian wrongdoing in Ukraine, then you're not a real journalist. But apparently when it comes to Zelensky, real journalism is that type of interview you just saw there from CNN where you don't ask him any real hardball questions at all when we're talking about sending billions of taxpayer dollars to support a war that is costing Ukrainians lives, right? I'm just saying, I mean, I don't really understand why the media has this type of bias, but I do understand why, because again, you know, the media has to push what the military-industrial complex wants the American people to hear in regards to the narrative that is going to continue to funnel money into their pockets and ultimately into the politicians' pockets, the plutocrats' pockets, in the form of campaign donations. Again, this is what I try to tell you guys. I mean, the United States, for as much as people want to talk about democracy and republic, the United States really is a plutocracy, okay? We're a country run by and for the rich. What you hear on these mainstream liberal media outlets is what the plutocrats want you to hear, right? And they don't want to let the American people hear anything that is going to make them not keep the money train rolling in for them in the form of taxpayer dollars going to these defense contractors that are sending these weapons to Ukraine. So let's continue on here.
But apparently, that's not why Tucker went to Moscow. During the Cold War, gullible Westerners who spread Soviet propaganda were dismissed as useful idiots. But calling Tucker that is unfair to useful idiots. No, he's made a cynical decision to chase MAGA's affection for dictators. And what better way to cash in than Putin's Kremlin? All right, Brett, tell me why I'm wrong.
You are not wrong. You are not wrong. And any of us who have had opportunities to interview bad guys, and as we should, ask tough questions and hold them at least to a moment in a spotlight to which they are not accustomed. And what you saw there, I mean, I think I mentioned this to you, you're looking at the Tokyo Rose of our day, basically broadcasting fascist propaganda to credulous people in the West who are eager to buy into the mythology of Putin as a champion of the Nordic races against their enemies and as an enemy of wokeness. It's one of the most disgraceful. To call it a journalistic performance is wrong because he's not a journalist. Right. I don't even think it was a performance. It was just simply being a scribe to one of the most vicious dictators of our time.
So you see how this guy just smeared Putin for like a minute straight, but did not give one reason why Putin is a bad guy or why he's wrong or why the war in Ukraine is unjustified. And the reason why I'm saying this is because if all of these things are true, okay, the war is unjustified. And I'm saying I agree. I do think it's unjustified. I think that you need to tell the American people why. Explain to the American people why you're saying these things, right? Don't just smear and, say that, well, Putin bad, right? Fascist, Kremlin talking points. Okay, but why, right? Go a little bit deeper than that. But they never do. They dumb it down and they just throw out these insults without explaining why they're insulting the guy. And again, this is why people don't trust the media. Right? This is why people don't think highly of these so-called journalists anymore. And you have people like Tucker that are going out on their own and doing their own thing, and they're getting much more, views. They're landing these interviews. They have much more relevance than guys like this, who I don't even know this guy's name. I don't know anything about him, right? Because he doesn't seem like a serious guy, right? You're not a serious person when all you do is smear people, but you can't even tell us why are you smearing him, right? If Putin's such a bad guy, tell us why. Right? Give us an explanation. That would be helpful, right? To help the American people understand our position and why we have the position that we have. But it's nothing but Putin bad, right? Fascist, Kremlin, right? That's all it is.
He did sit there. That was astonishing for that half hour, allowing Putin to go on about the history. I mean, it just wasn't even very good. It was like watching someone who can't play a sport just fumble over and over again.
So again, see, this is what I'm talking about. Again, it's stuff like this that it really bothers me. Putin telling the history of Russia, Ukraine, that whole region is actually central to understanding the conflict, right? And that's what, again, it blows my mind because a lot of people are criticizing Tucker for letting Putin talk about history when you can't understand that conflict without actually understanding the history. Like, Putin talking about history is not just Putin trying to flex his knowledge. No, Putin is telling you, look, this is the historical context behind this situation, and you actually do need to understand the history because there is a lot of history behind it to understand the conflict in and of itself. But again, this is the American media, right? They want to dumb everything down so that you don't really understand and you can't make up your own mind and form your own opinion based off the facts and the history. No, we can't allow you to do that. You just don't need to understand anything about the conflict. Just listen to what we say. Putin bad, Russia bad, right? And that's it, okay? And that's why I think the American media falls short. And this is the type of things that Putin was bringing up in the interview about how the American media conglomerates are the biggest spreaders of propaganda in the world, which, I mean, hey, watching this right here, again, watching how these so-called journalists don't actually do real journalism, watching them boohoo, whine, and cry about Tucker Carlson doing journalism instead of asking tough questions and trying to educate the viewer and to, present arguments from both sides so that people can decide for themselves. Again, that's the reason why people don't trust the media anymore, right? The distrust in the media actually has helped Putin more than anything, right? The failure for these so-called journalists to do their jobs is why Putin has the credibility that he has in the United States with some groups of people. And again, the funny part is that these people don't realize it. They don't even understand that. They don't understand that at all.
Interviewer.
What do you think Tucker was up to in Moscow?
Blinis? I don't know. I don't know what he was doing.
Rehabilitating himself.
Yeah,
He's trying to make himself relevant.
Attention for himself because he's not
Chris,
washed up. He's washed up, I guess. I guess that's how I put it.
Washed up. Again, he's scoring interviews with Putin, with leaders of the most powerful nations in the world, and you're saying he's washed up. How is he washed up? Again, these are ad hominem attacks with no substance whatsoever behind these attacks. No substance. Just nothing but an ad hominem. This is hating, right? This is what we call hating. You're jealous. You're upset that he doesn't need CNN. He doesn't need MSNBC. He doesn't need ABC. He doesn't need legacy media in order to still be relevant. That's what this is. That's what this is.
Trying to get attention for himself and make himself relevant, that I can score this interview. And the reason he scored this interview is because he's a lapdog.
I'm surprised you didn't mention, though, the fact that he did ask some questions about Evan Gershkovich, the
come
Wall Street
on.
Journal
He had to.
reporter who has been detained, and he was forceful about it. He pressed the issue.
I wouldn't say this.
I think he was
First of all, he wasn't
fantasizing that he
forceful
was-
about it, and secondly, he said, well, maybe he was a
He
spy.
let him
Maybe
say
he
he
took
was a
some
spy.
information, and the Wall Street Journal said no. He's a journalist.
That's right.
Which Tucker Carlson isn't.
My proudest achievement, the one thing I have on my wall, is that I was banned for life from Russia. And I think we should have more journalists who are in that category rather than in this one.
Well,
the panel is back with their
guy. Again, that was just almost 4 minutes of ad hominem attacks against Tucker with no substance whatsoever to back up the reason behind the attacks, except Putin bad, right? Russia evil. I mean, you have Tucker over there trying to implore Putin to release an American journalist, and they're trying to find ways to criticize Tucker for that, even though, again, he's trying to get an American journalist released by Putin. Again, this is just ridiculous. Which, again, hey, you need to actually make real arguments and to tell us why you believe these things instead of just saying these things if you want to have credibility. But again, this is just what you call hating, right? This is jealousy, okay? They're just mad because Tucker scored his interview and they're not in the same position that he's in, and they don't have nearly as much relevance as Tucker, despite the fact that, again, they have multi-billion-dollar media conglomerates behind them. The state of journalism in the United States is extremely, extremely, extremely depressing and sad, right? And they're really working against what they claim that they want, which is credibility. They're destroying their credibility with stuff like this. Let me know what you guys think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.